The most infamous, notorious and ruthless male lion was Mr. T of the most famous coalition to ever rule in the African bush, the Mapogo lions. Also referred to as the Brothers in Blood, the Lions of Sabi Sands. The most aggressive, most brutal and ruthless, Mr. T was a lion like no others. He was unpredictable. At some stage of his ruthless life, he earned the nickname Satan because he brutally killed his own brother's cubs. Mr. T loved his all 5 Mapogo brothers, but he had a special bonding with his best friend, partner in crime, Kinky Tail. And he was the only one who stood up by his side to save his brother in a terrible situation.
Come open area. You go jackal.
Mr. T was born to the Sparta or Eyrefield pride of the Sabi Sands around 2001 or 2002, which became the Mapogo Coalition. He became Nomad in 2004. In 2006, the Mapogo brothers started to advertise their presence as they were now big enough and strong enough to establish a significant territory of their own. Mr. T and his 5 brothers, Mapogo, Kinky Tail, Dreadlocks, Rasta and Pretty Boy just a few months later were the largest coalition in the entire Sabi Sand. By using their numbers advantage of 6, they would kill any dominant male who stood in their way. They would also kill cubs and any lioness who would try to defend them. In just a few months, these 6 Mapogo brothers dominated over half the entire reserve. In 2008, despite ruling a large territory, the Mapogo Coalition wasn't functioning smoothly due to internal rivalry. Many fights often broke out with the leader Mapogo and Mr. T. A closely contested clash then happened with Mr. T and Mapogo, in which Mapogo managed to grab and bite Mr. T's legs and win the encounter. After this fight, it was observed that Mr. T and Kinky Tail broke off from their 4 brothers and headed east to control the northern part of the territory. During this time, the Sparta and Styx pride were under control by Roller Coaster Male. Mr. T and Kinky Tail attempted to sneak up on Roller Coaster, but the lionesses were having none of it and attacked both Mr. T and Kinky Tail, which gave time for the dominant male to escape. Because of this, the both brothers ended up going back to the western sector. A few days later, the brothers had returned, but this time they had serious backup, everyone apart from Mapogo. Shortly after arriving, the Mapogos quickly took over the Styx and Sparta pride. The Mapogos now have 8 prides at this time under their control. They controlled almost all of Sabi Sand, just leaving the southern section reserved from their control. Mr. T and Kinky Tail stayed in the eastern sector, while their 3 brothers returned to western Sabi Sand to join Mapogo. Over the next year, the strong duo of Mr. T and Kinky Tail stood guard over their territory against many intruders. They were not only defending from the east, but also defending their brothers in the west, as the entire western part of the reserve is fenced, meaning the only way to enter was through Mr. T and Kinky Tail. In the year of 2010, it had been 4 years since the Mapogos had taken over their first territory. They had defended the territory from multiple intruders, but they were about to meet their biggest challenge they had ever faced. A coalition of 5 Majingilane males had entered the Mapogos territory. These 5 brothers were between 4 to 5 years old at this time, and had their sights set on the rich domain of the Mapogo Coalition. The 5 brothers started to roar and scent mark the territory. Mr. T and Kinky Tail accepted the challenge as they have never lost a fight before. June 8, 2010, a young member of the Majingilane Coalition was resting in the thick bush, and when they realized Mr. T and Kinky Tail were closing in on him, they had not spotted him but were definitely aware of his presence. Once they got too close, the Majingilane male decided to attempt to flee from the 2 brothers, but it was too late. Both Mr. T and Kinky Tail grabbed and pinned him to the ground. The young Majingilane gave it his all, but sadly he never stood a chance against such a dominant force. However, he did manage to slightly injure both Mr. T and Kinky Tail before he finally succumbed to his battle wounds. Mr. T had a gash over his eye and Kinky Tail was walking with a massive limp from a damaged bitten paw. The Majingilane Coalition was now down to just 4 members. That same day or evening, all the remaining Majingilane brothers were on the move. It was clear they had sense of the incident earlier and were out for blood and revenge on the Mapogos for the death of their brother. Under the cover of darkness, the Majingilane brothers managed to isolate Kinky Tail, and from Kinky Tail, being already injured from the fight earlier with his damaged paw, he was still brazen enough to attempt to take on the 4 Majingilane brothers on his own. Sadly, they quickly managed to overpower Kinky Tail and pin him to the ground and rip him apart. Mr. T tried to rescue his brother Kinky Tail but had arrived too late to be able to save Kinky Tail, but Mr. T still attempted to take on a few Majingilanes but was ultimately forced to flee for his life. The 4 Majingilanes chased Mr. T, but luckily he managed to get away. After this, the Majingilanes came back to finally finish off Kinky Tail. He was practically eaten alive. The Majingilanes proceeded to roar and advertise themselves as the new rulers of the area. Over the next few weeks, Mr. T was seen in the company of the Salala Pride. He was still calling for his dead brother Kinky Tail, so instead of his brother hearing his calls, it was heard by the Majingilanes males, who once again attacked Mr. T. He was beaten by the Majingilanes brothers, but once again managed to escape with his life. After the death of Kinky Tail, Mr. T did not go to the west. He roared for his brother at the gates for 2 days non-stop. He then went to protect and defend the Salala Pride, and he and the cubs of Kinky Tail. On the 29th, the 4 Majingilanes came for Mr. T. Mr. T fought them alone again, and 2 cubs were killed. They could at 4 not kill Mr. T. He was battered and bruised, and then he went to the west side to rejoin with his 4 remaining Mapogo brothers. Mr. T stayed around Juma for 1 more day, then he moved south to Mala Mala. But in June 10, 2010, he went back to Juma to look for Kinky Tail. It is believed that he visited the exact spot where Kinky Tail died. Then he moved again back to Mala Mala to protect the Sticks and the Sparta Pride. He had a brief fight with the 4 Majingilane but managed to escape. Then he went to protect the Salala Pride. But the Salala Lioness was not accepting him. This time the fight was more fearsome because he fought, he got injured, and then he escaped again. After that, Mr. T ran back to the western sector and met up with his remaining 4 brothers. The Majingilane males quickly eat away the eastern part of the Mapogo's territory and took over their prides after killing all the cubs of the former kings.
Oh no.
In the western sector, the 5 Mapogo brothers were still the kings. Mr. T actually came back and slaughtered all his brothers' cubs. Estimated around 11 were killed over a period of a few months, picked off slowly. His brothers never attempted to stop him doing this. This kind of vicious behavior earned him the nickname Satan. Now there are only 3 Mapogos left. Makhulu, the oldest leader, who was about 12 years old and way beyond his prime. Pretty Boy, who was about 10 years old and his prime years were also behind him. And Mr. T, who was about 8 years old and still had a lot to offer, despite losing 3 members in just a few months. The Mapogo Coalition held onto power. The western sector was still their domain and they controlled a couple of prides. In 2011, a coalition of 4 Saloti males were pushed into the Mapogo territory by the Majingalanes. Once the Mapogos learned of these intruders, it was a proof test of the strength of the 3 brothers in driving them back out into the southern regions of Sabi Sands for the remainder of the year. In early 2012, the Mapogo territory was yet again invaded by the 4 Saloti. During the absence of the Mapogos, one of the females of resident prides went on to mate with the new males. This was all the Salatis needed, as the urge to find females brought them closer west deep into the Mapogos-controlled area. The conflict was inevitable, and in February 2012, the Salatis laid a few blows into the aging Mapogos way beyond their prime. The Mapogo Coalition was no match for the fury of these 4 young Saloti brothers. In the daytime of March 16, 2012, the young Southern Pride males, known as the Salatis, successfully caught Mr. T. They quickly mauled him, and the attack was so brutal, with a huge gash on his back. You could hear him actually screaming in pain, and a sound so horrifying when one of the Saloti male bites and snaps Mr. T's spine, paralyzing him. Even with this unimaginably painful injury, he still continued fighting till his last breath, never giving up. Mr. T even looked at times directly into the ranger's eyes. It was almost like it was the only slight bit of comfort he managed to find in dying, being surrounded by those who watched him as a cub. the demise of Mr. T, the Mapogo era was over. The victors claimed their new territory, and the world witnessed the end of an era. The end of the mighty Mapogo Lions.